Hello, I'm Ed Rabyd, otherwise known as the Rabyd Atheist, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. You're free to like or dislike the videos, so feel free to hit those buttons. You feel free to comment below, and I would appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel and hit your notification bell for more content as it is released. You're also free to share my videos as much as you like. My business is education, so this is me kind of educating you on the inside scoop of, in particular, the life of Jesus, but also on how there are massive problems in the Bible, but they are willfully ignored at times, and I hope to demonstrate that with this series as I go forward. This is going to be a video that basically concludes part 3, and the issue for us in part 3 has been to look at Jesus's early life, from the birth of John the Baptist onward, and we have kind of covered that. We've looked at the announcement of Jesus's birth. We've looked at all these other things, but throughout this entire looking at all these different events of Jesus's life, we've had a couple of criteria, and I want to go over those criteria again, and then go back and ask ourselves the question: which events of all the ones we've covered here in part 3 have actually had fulfillment of those criteria? The main criteria I've been looking at is the Bible's own criteria: in the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every fact be established. This is a legal criteria that has been around since the law of Moses. And the claim by Christians, as always, is that, the Gospels constitute 4 witnesses of Jesus Christ, 4 separate witnesses, and therefore we have multiple witnesses of Jesus's life and ministry, and so therefore fulfills the 2 or 3 mandate. I have already demonstrated up to this point, up to the time that Jesus is 12 years old in the temple debating with lawyers, that's just not true. When we look at the birth of John the Baptist being foretold, only Luke talks about that. The Annunciation of the birth of Jesus to Mary, only Luke talks about that. Mary visits Elizabeth, only Luke talks about that. The birth of John the Baptist, once again, only Luke talks about that. No other gospel mentions it at that point. There are 2 genealogies at this point, but Matthew's genealogies and Luke's genealogies are completely different. The theory being that one is Luke is maybe the genealogy through Mary, and the other one is the genealogy through Joseph. The problem with both these genealogies is that they do have some common points of reference, but also the generations are weird, and compared with some of the Old Testament lists, they don't always jive up. So, the inerrant Word of God seems to make a lot of mistakes and a lot of errors when it comes to these genealogies. And none of these names, many of them, I can't say none of them, but a good chunk of them cannot be verified. It's simply something that that people have recited over the years. Mistakes can be made, and that's just simply true. So up to this point, we still only have 1 witnesses, and the 2 witnesses we have of the genealogies are completely different. So they're obviously talking about Jesus' lineage from 2 different directions, at least, at bare minimum. We then have the birth of Jesus, but Matthew only goes over Joseph's wrestling with whether to take Mary as his wife. He finally does so, and she gives birth. It's Luke that gives us the full account of that birth in Bethlehem with the shepherds and angels. The thing about the birth of Jesus is, yes, there's 2 accounts of it where it says that Jesus was born, but the stories behind each of those births are completely different. They don't overlap. They're not even talking about the same events. One is more of a pre-birth of Jesus, up to his birth. It's kind of like the birth of Jesus becomes the climax, whereas in the case of Luke, the birth is there, and then the climax is when the shepherds come and visit after hearing from the angels. So the 2 stories are very different, very divergent, and talk about different events. The only similarity that they share is they mention that Jesus was born, and that's it. A baby was born somewhere. Not a great announcement, fairly common. Don't get me wrong, the birth of babies is important, but it's not particularly to the parents, but it happens every day, and that doesn't necessarily make anybody special. You have the watching shepherds incident, Jesus is circumcised, and his presentation in the temple are only recorded in Luke. We have the wise men from the east, which is only recorded in Matthew. It's not recorded in any other gospel. The flight to Egypt is only recorded in Matthew, along with the slaughter of the innocents, also only in Matthew. The only time that Matthew and Luke actually converge again is when there is mention of the fact that they moved to Nazareth, and that's where Jesus grew up. Then Luke gives us the story all by itself, only in Luke, of Jesus in the temple with the lawyers and doctors and them asking questions and him asking questions and everybody being astounded. Up to this point, I want to point out that this story nowhere has had 2 or 3 witnesses except in 2 things. 1, that Jesus was born, and 2, that they moved to Nazareth. Those are the only 2 things where we have 2 witnesses. Everything else is a standalone story by one gospel writer. And the place where we do have 2, there's nothing miraculous about it. There's nothing interesting about it. A baby is born in one case that everybody claims is the Messiah, but so far there's been no evidence given for that. There's also a record that somebody moved from here to there. Well, the Trojans or the Greeks moved to Troy when they fought them. Big deal. The fact that people move around in stories is nothing new. Hell, The Lord of the Rings is nothing more than one big long walk with a few incidents on it that are exciting. So, travel is not something, unusual. It's fairly common in any story. And so, the fact that somebody moves from one place and settles down in another isn't really remarkable. So on our first criteria, we have yet to really see major truth claims, be made by any more than one witness at a time. And the nature of these witnesses also begins to be a problem, which is our second criteria, is to look at whether the witnesses are credible, if there's any other oddities that we need to consider. The problem with both Matthew and Luke is the authors are unnamed. We don't really know that it's Matthew and Luke. This tradition has come about that these 2 Gospels were written by Matthew and Luke. There's no actual evidence of that. That's one of the trade secrets of every pastor that steps into the pulpit. If he's paying attention in his Life of Christ or Harmony of the Gospels class, or he actually takes one of the Gospels as a course, he will quickly discover that the authors who write that book or study, if they know what they're saying, will tell you flat out that they don't know who really wrote the book. Tradition says X. Tradition is nothing more than something that we all agree upon. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily right or truthful. So we have that problem. The problem with the gospel story, particularly of Jesus' early life, his birth, his early life, and everything else, is we don't really have anything to go on except conjecture. We don't have the 2 or 3 witnesses, and the stories that are recounted are only recounted by one witness, but they also have massive problems. Because sometimes in certain cases, the story could have only been witnessed by one person, and we don't even know if that person was alive at the time of the gospel writing. So once again, we have basically a growing legend idea, and I think that's probably the greatest thing, because all these Gospels, Matthew and Luke, both of them, wrote after Mark. Mark has no birth narrative. He is the earliest Gospel to write. It is other Gospels, namely Matthew and Luke, and partially, the pre-existing Christ is put in there by John. These people add on to what Mark has said, and they have no collaborating resources or witnesses of it at all. There is no 2 or 3 witnesses, but each of these people may very simply be trying to tell a better story. I like the Gospel of Mark, and we're finally going to get into it. Up till now, we haven't touched Mark, and this is significant. Mark being the oldest Gospel, it would have been closest to the actual events of Jesus' life, and thus would have had the least amount of chance of corruption or legend building inside of it. And yet it doesn't have a birth narrative. It doesn't have the 3 wise men. It doesn't have Herod slaughtering the innocents. It doesn't have this flight into Egypt and return. It doesn't have these prophecies over Jesus. Those all come 10, 20 years later after Mark writes. This kind of indicates to me that Luke and Matthew, the writers of them, had copies of Mark and kind of just added some more stories. This is exactly what you would expect to see if Jesus' life is nothing more than a growing legend. it's, Matthew, when I read Mark, I get a very realistic Jesus. By the time we get to John, John has given Jesus superpowers. John's Jesus is literally Superman. And it's like, if this was comic books 2,000 years later, we would have called it another great Superman comic. But it's not. It's written 2,000 years ago by a bunch of people who thought that they saw something, who convinced themselves that they had saw something. And so we have that, issue of, is this nothing more than a growing legend? And I say it is. My theory still remains that Jesus of Nazareth was a real rabbi. And he may have very well been astounding as a teacher. In fact, the one place we have great collaboration about Jesus, even with Gospels outside the four, is Jesus' teachings. There is a great body of Gospels that record Jesus' teaching, and there is a lot of overlap. I would say that if Jesus of Nazareth did exist, the one thing we know for sure is that his teachings, we know those. Okay? And he may very well have angered the priestly class, and the priestly class may very well have had him killed, maybe by the Romans. I don't know. Maybe it was an issue of convenience. But what would have happened to Jesus' body? The most common result after crucifixion is the Romans wouldn't give the victim the dignity of a burial. They would actually bury those bodies in a mass grave. So when people say, well, where's the body? My atheist response is now in some mass grave in Palestine somewhere and unidentified and impossible to identify. That's why there's no body. Okay? So it's not that, Jesus may not have existed. It's just by the time we get to Mark, there's definitely some little bit of legend embellishing. Matthew and Luke in the birth narratives really add to that and really embellish the narrative. And that's why we begin to see what I would call a growing legend, something where Jesus is becoming more as the story gets told more and more over the years. Now, I do want to take a few moments before we branch into part 4, which, as kind of a precursor, I'm going to talk in part 4, I'm going to talk about the baptism of Jesus Christ and the ministry of John the Baptist. We're going to talk about the temptation of Christ. And we're going to talk about some of the early ministry of Christ. And we're going to spend a lot of time on that part in the early ministry of Christ, camped in John, because John is one of the few people that really talks about the early ministry of Jesus and really talks about some of the issues that take place there. But once again, he's the only one. So we only have one witness of that stuff. The main point at this point, though, is that after 12, what would have happened normally to a young 12-year-old Jewish boy at this time, for the next 18 years approximately, Jesus would have grown up in Nazareth. According to the text, he grew up in wisdom and stature for men. We next see Jesus actually teaching and also entering into a synagogue and getting the scrolls and reading it. This would indicate to me that somewhere along the line, Jesus did indeed start getting trained by the rabbis, or at least going through the motions of rabbinical training if he is supposedly the Son of God. But I suspect that Jesus of Nazareth simply had some brilliant ideas that, as part of the Hillel school, which he clearly is a part, if you compare his teachings to the Hillel school of teaching and of Jewish thought, they align very close. Jesus is not the first one to say some of the things that are said in the Sermon on the Mount, for that matter. And because of that, I think Jesus may have been very intelligent, very brilliant, and may have caught the attention of the attendants. And so therefore, he begins to do some of that religious training. And he is called a rabbi in the story. In order for that to happen, a lot of things have to happen that most Christians don't want to talk about. Number one, Jesus would have had to submit himself to other rabbis until they felt he was ready to earn the title of rabbi. He would have had to go through rabbinical training where he learned how to handle the Torah, learned to read from the Torah, had memorized all the Torah. It would have happened. The other part that people don't want to talk about is most rabbis and most people that took on the religious leader aspect in that day and age had to be married. And this is something that No, Jesus was never married. He was always celibate. Don't have any evidence of it. The text never makes that claim. I remember pointing that out to a friend of mine. I said, the text never makes a claim that Jesus was celibate. That's your assumption. And he's like, and, he went off in a huff, and he started reading through it, and he said, oh, you're right. It doesn't say he was celibate. Nope. And he sure was a follower around by a lot of women. Was he one of those kind of grace guys that said, hey, let's go over to this tent and get horizontal? This is something that Christians don't want to talk about, but it's right there in your face. Because most rabbis, most religious leaders, with very, very, very few exceptions, got married before they could take on the full mantle. Part of that life was to marry your 15, 16-year-old bride at probably age 26, 28, grow up with it, and then earn the title. If Jesus did that, he has an unnamed wife. There is no mention of her in the story, so that kind of makes things a little bit weird. But there is mention of a lot of women in Jesus' life right out the gate and in the early ministry. So, it's what caused me to one time think, I wonder if I could apply the aspects of a cult leader to Jesus and see how many that he has. And could I put in the sexual ones, because we don't really know? And I would have to say I couldn't do that because it would be pure conjecture. Don't know what Jesus' personal relationships were away from his teaching and healing ministry. But it's an interesting thing to ponder. But the other thing that we need to remember is that in order for Jesus to be called rabbi, and to be called rabbi by some of the religious officials, the fact that in the story Nicodemus will call him teacher, aka rabbi, indicates to me that Nicodemus recognized that he was indeed an official rabbi of the Jewish faith. And that seems to me to be the most believable part of the story. The rest of it just gets plain strange. And once again, we see this growing legend. Mark brings us down to earth a lot, but even he adds and embellishes some things, particularly with miracles and stuff, that kind of indicate the beginnings of the growing legend. By the time we get to John, as you'll see as we go through the Gospels, John has Jesus with superpowers. He is literally Superman. I want to thank you all again for stopping by my channel. I hope you've enjoyed this recap and this little brief introduction to part 4 as we're going to get into it. I want to thank you all for stopping by my channel. You're free to like or dislike the video. You're free to comment. You're free to subscribe and get your notifications. And you're free to share these videos. I want to thank you all for coming back in and just sitting around and listening to me pontificate about the life of Jesus. It's something that I do engage regularly on this channel because I used to teach it so vehemently. And now as an atheist, I want to set the record straight that there were a lot of questions that I developed because of teaching the life of Christ that eventually made me realize that my faith was useless because it's built on fantasy. It's built on this desire to live forever and to be important. Two things that every human being seems to desire these days and always has. Religion gives you that. And one of the best religions to do that is Christianity. But in the final analysis, Jesus' life has a lot of questions over it. So many. And even it doesn't always meet the biblical criteria of 2 or 3 witnesses of his life. I want to thank you once again for coming by. And hopefully someday I can convince you to be a rabid atheist like myself. In the meantime, this is Rabyd the Rabid Atheist signing off and wishing you a good day.